That night Seattle was cold and soaked in rain. I was driving when a familiar voice came from the back seat. "Hurry up, we're late." I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw my son. 6 months earlier, he had voted to fire me from the very company I founded. Now I was driving him in an old car, one I bought with the money from selling my house. He didn't recognize me right away. When he got out, he left a small tip and said, "This car doesn't really fit this neighborhood." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and wondered how a father could become invisible so quickly. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to subscribe and walk with me through the stories that come next. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now. Now, let me tell you why I was sitting behind that wheel on a rainy night in Seattle. I didn't say a word as the car pulled away. The door closed, the rain swallowed the sound, and the brightly lit neighborhood behind me faded into something unfamiliar. I had lived with that feeling for 6 months now, the feeling of being pushed out of everything I once built. Not just out of a company, but out of my own life story. 6 months earlier, I was still sitting at the head of the conference table on the 12th floor of Miller Software Solutions. I chose that room myself years ago because the morning light hit the glass board just right. I believed in small details like that. Jordan didn't. That day, my son sat across from me, beside faces I barely recognized anymore. The board had slowly changed during the years I was busy with treatments and gradual handovers. I thought it was a natural process. I was wrong. The meeting ended faster than I expected. Jordan talked about speed, the market, a new generation mindset. He mentioned my age like a data point, not an accusation. The others nodded. By the time the final vote was cast, I knew the decision had been made long before I walked into that room. I wasn't convinced. I was replaced. After the meeting, Jordan asked me into the private office. That room used to be mine. He spoke slowly, clearly, like he was reading from a memo. My time was over. The company needed someone not weighed down by family emotions. I heard every word, but what stayed with me wasn't what he said. It was how he avoided looking me in the eye. When I asked about retirement benefits and my founder shares, he said the lawyers would handle it. At the time, I didn't know that lawyer was Victoria, his ex-wife. The days that followed moved faster than I imagined. Access was revoked. My name disappeared from company accounts. Payments were frozen under review. I hired a lawyer, but every call came with another bill. The house I lived in for over 30 years went up for sale, quietly. I didn't tell the neighbors. I didn't tell old friends in the industry. I didn't want to explain how I had failed like this. I didn't buy the car because I liked it. It was what I could afford with what was left after legal fees. I signed up to drive for hire because I needed cash, and because I didn't know what else I could do. Driving kept my mind busy. I could listen to other people talk about their lives, without having to answer. I learned how to get used to being looked through. At office buildings where I once walked in with my own access card, I now parked at the curb and waited. I drove young people who talked about funding rounds and growth strategies. They used words I once taught my own team. They didn't know that, and I didn't say anything. Some nights I asked myself where I went wrong, not in business, but in family. I believed that if I built something strong enough, it would run itself the right way. I didn't notice the distance growing between Jordan and me, alongside the company. I thought delegation was enough. I didn't realize that power without boundaries changes people. That dinner pickup wasn't the first time I drove well-dressed passengers, but it was the first time I drove my past. I didn't react, not because I was afraid, but because I had grown used to swallowing the things left unsaid. I drove on, accepted another ride, as if he were just another passenger. I didn't know that only a few hours later another ride would reset the entire story. I didn't know that some things I left behind had never truly disappeared. All I knew was that night in that old car and cold rain, I was still breathing. I still remembered every decision I had signed in my life. And maybe, somewhere, those decisions were still waiting for me to come back and face them. The next ride popped up on my screen while I was still parked at the curb, wiping the windshield. The passenger name was Eleanor Vance. Pickup was in a quiet neighborhood north of the city. I accepted without thinking much. That night, I just wanted to keep driving until I was completely worn out. She got in slowly, carrying the scent of old paper and a soft perfume. She sat in the back, buckled her seatbelt carefully, and gave me the address. After a few minutes of silence, she asked me to take a longer route, through an old industrial area on the edge of Seattle. I almost asked why. Then I didn't. People usually have their reasons, and I no longer had the habit of being curious. As we turned off the main road, the streetlights thinned out. Low warehouses, metal fences, and faded signs appeared through the rain. I had driven through this area years ago, but I had forgotten it. Eleanor looked out the window, then suddenly asked my name. I told her. She went quiet for a few seconds, then spoke slowly, as if testing her own memory. You worked at Evergreen Telecom, didn't you? Late 1980s. I hesitated. That name hadn't been part of my life in a long time. I nodded, eyes still on the road. She continued, more certain now. She mentioned a fiber infrastructure project I had worked on, a small company called Cascade Core. I remembered. I remembered the nights sleeping at the office, blueprints spread across the tables, and the decision to walk away while things were still unfinished. I told her that company never went anywhere, that I had stepped aside to focus on software, took a modest payout, and closed that chapter. Eleanor shook her head. She said I left, but the company didn't. It stayed quiet, expanding piece by piece, signing contracts without ever making headlines. It became invisible infrastructure, something people never notice but can't live without. She asked me to pull over. I did. Eleanor opened her bag and took out a tablet. She wasn't in a hurry. She scrolled through several documents, then turned the screen toward me. I saw the company name. I saw the figures, and I saw a line of text that made me read it more than once. She said my original contract included a clause, one I had personally signed. 15% ownership, non-dilutable, triggered only if the company was fully sold. The clause had been kept quiet to avoid unnecessary complications. I had forgotten, or maybe I had tried to forget. Eleanor said Cascade Core had just been acquired by a multinational corporation. She said my share was worth $333 million. The number didn't create emotion right away. It was too large to react to. I watched the rain slide down the windshield, trying to keep my hands steady on the wheel. In my mind, the months of driving, selling my house, and stacks of unpaid bills passed by like a silent film. I asked her why she had come looking for me. Eleanor said she needed my signature to complete the final transaction. She had searched for months through old contacts and legal records. When she saw me appear on a driving platform, she knew the moment had arrived. She didn't offer comfort. She just stated facts, one sentence at a time, the way people talk about the weather. I sat there for a long while, not because I doubted her, but because I needed time to put everything back in order inside my head. I thought about Jordan. I thought about that short meeting, the locked accounts. I thought about how easily I had accepted it all. Eleanor didn't rush me. She waited. When I started the engine again, my hands were still shaking slightly. I drove us on through the old industrial district. She pointed to a wide piece of land and said it had once been Cascade Core's first operations center. I looked at the dark buildings and realized I was standing in front of a part of my life I had walked away from, but it had never walked away from me. That night, I drove Eleanor back to her hotel. Before getting out, she said she would send me the full documents the next day. She said I didn't need to decide immediately. I nodded. As the car rolled away, I knew I wouldn't be able to return to my old rhythm of life. Some numbers don't just change a bank account. They force a person to face the questions they've avoided for far too long. The next morning, I didn't go out early like I usually did. I sat at the kitchen table and opened each file Eleanor had sent. Contracts. Addendums. My signature from 30 years ago. The ink had faded, but the clause was still clear. 15% ownership preserved until a full sale. I read slowly, as if I were rereading an old promise I had forgotten I ever made. Eleanor called me around noon. She spoke plainly. Time was not on our side. The deal needed my signature to close, and confidentiality was mandatory. The non-disclosure clause wasn't meant to hide me. It was meant to protect me. If the news came out too early, people would try to apply pressure. Some would even try to twist the situation. I understood. I had once been on the other side of negotiations like that. We met at her law office, a low building, no large sign out front. I didn't wear a suit. I still wasn't used to the idea that I held any kind of leverage. The lawyers spoke little and handed over many documents. They confirmed my ownership. They confirmed the value. And they repeated the confidentiality obligation. I signed what was needed for the preparation phase, but not the final sale documents. Eleanor didn't ask why. She knew I needed more time. During the waiting days, I began to see things differently. I no longer drove all day, but I kept the app active. I wanted that familiar feeling, like a temporary anchor. Whenever I had time, I read deeper into the contracts tied to Cascade Core. That's when I noticed a familiar name appearing again and again among the major clients. Miller Software Solutions. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but the deeper I went, the clearer the dependency became. Jordan's most critical data center was running on infrastructure owned by Cascade Core, not just leased bandwidth. Their core operations sat entirely on land and systems I had once helped build. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt cold. I called Eleanor. She wasn't surprised. She said that connection was exactly why she needed my direct involvement. There was a clause in the service agreement rarely mentioned, a clause about security and ethics. It allowed for immediate termination if one party committed serious violations of legal or ethical business standards. The clause existed to protect infrastructure from risk, and it was very specific. That was when I understood this wasn't just unexpected money. This was an intersection, a place where past decisions collided with the present. I thought about how Jordan had removed me from the company, not with one major mistake, but with a series of cold actions legalized by paperwork. I had no intention of responding with emotion. If there was going to be a confrontation, I would do it the only way I truly understood, by reading contracts and respecting every line. Eleanor and I agreed on a cautious plan. First, complete the ownership verification and prepare for the sale. At the same time, the legal team would review the relationship between Cascade Core and Miller Software Solutions. I didn't interfere. I only provided historical context, old decisions, and how the company I built once operated. Everything else, I let the documents speak for themselves. There were nights I couldn't sleep, not from fear, but because I was resetting my own boundaries. I asked myself what I really wanted. Revenge is an easy word to say, and a hard one to control. I didn't want to destroy anything just to feel satisfied. I wanted the truth exposed, and fairness restored in a sustainable way. If that meant an empire had to shut down part of its operations because of its own violations, then that would be a consequence, not a goal. One afternoon, Eleanor showed me the final risk analysis. It highlighted weaknesses in Jordan's governance, risky decisions masked by the language of growth. None of it looked catastrophic on its own, but under the light of the security and ethics clause, it became impossible to ignore. I looked at the pages and realized something. Real power wasn't in the $333 million. It was in the ability to make people accountable for their choices. That night, I turned off the driving app. I knew I was stepping into a different phase, not to reclaim an old position, but to face what had been pushed aside. When I signed the remaining documents needed for the sale, I understood that I was holding a tool. The question wasn't whether I would use it, but how far I would go to make sure nothing crossed the line I believed was right. I didn't give any advance notice before sending the formal document. It was an old habit from my days running the company. When something has been verified long enough, the announcement doesn't need to be gentle. The letter went out from Cascade Core's law office in its role as infrastructure owner. My name was at the bottom. No title, no personal explanation. The response came faster than I expected. Jordan requested an urgent meeting. He didn't call me himself. His lawyer did. Victoria Reed. Her voice was calm, professional, just like it had been back when I still signed contracts with her on minor matters. She suggested we meet at company headquarters in the boardroom. I agreed. That morning I wore a suit for the first time in months. Not to impress anyone. I just wanted to feel familiar to myself again. When I entered the building, security checked my name on the guest list. A brief hesitation. Then the door opened. I walked down hallways I once traveled every day, but now no one recognized me. Jordan was already seated in the boardroom, along with several board members, and Victoria. He stood when I entered. I saw surprise, not fully concealed. I didn't shake hands. I sat down and placed my folder on the table. No one spoke for the first few seconds. I let the silence stay. I didn't talk about family. I didn't mention the past. I talked about infrastructure, about contracts, about the security and ethics clause. My voice stayed level, not raised, not lowered. I laid out the points the legal team had confirmed. Governance decisions that carried violation risks, reports that had been adjusted, risks that had been ignored. I didn't accuse. I read. Jordan reacted exactly as I expected. He talked about market conditions, about competitive pressure. Victoria stepped in, trying to steer the discussion into technical language. I listened. When they stopped, I made my offer. Not a demand, a choice. First, the company would publicly acknowledge that my dismissal had been improper. All frozen benefits would be fully restored, and compensation for resulting losses would be provided. That money would not go to me. It would be placed into an independent fund for employees who had been unfairly terminated during the restructuring period. Second, the company would prepare a plan to separate from Cascade Corp's data center within 30 days. I made it clear the relocation would be complex and costly, but that was their option if they no longer wished to remain bound by the ethics clause. Third, and this was the moment the room went completely quiet, Jordan would step down as chief executive officer. Operational control would be transferred to a neutral executive agreed upon by the board and an independent third party. I said this was not punishment. It was protection, shielding the company from unchecked personal decision-making. Victoria was the first to understand. I saw it in her eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She knew the file was thick enough to create consequences no one in that room wanted to face publicly. Jordan was different. For the first time, he looked at me not as an opponent, but as a risk. The meeting ended without a final decision. They needed time. I left without turning back. I knew the pressure had already begun doing its work. 2 days later, Victoria contacted me privately. She asked to meet without Jordan. We met at a quiet cafe. She didn't circle around the point. She said Jordan had crossed lines in several transactions, and she had documents to prove it. She also said plainly that if those documents became public, her own career would be over. I listened. I didn't promise anything right away. I made it clear that any information would have to be handled within legal and ethical boundaries. I wouldn't protect anyone, including her. Victoria understood. She gave me copies of what she had in exchange for one condition: that I would not disclose violations directly tied to her professional role if they were not necessary for the company's restructuring. When I brought the materials to the legal team, the picture became clearer. No single action was enough on its own, but the pattern was. And that pattern led to one place the responsibility of the person at the top. That night I sat alone in the temporary apartment I was renting. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired, but it was the kind of tiredness that comes from reaching the end of a road you couldn't avoid. I knew the final decision was close, not driven by my emotions, but by the consequences of what had been recorded in signatures and in seals. The final decision didn't arrive in a dramatic meeting. It came as a brief statement sent out on a Monday morning. Jordan resigned as chief executive officer, citing personal reasons. The board appointed an independent interim manager. There was no public apology to me. Only one line acknowledging that my previous dismissal did not fully meet governance standards. For me, that was enough to close a chapter. The agreements were signed quietly. The compensation never entered my account. It went directly into a fund supporting employees who had been abruptly laid off during the restructuring period. I didn't need my name on that fund. I asked for only one thing: that the spending be transparent, and that the recipients be given a real chance to start over in any field they chose. The sale of Cascade Corp closed a few weeks later. When the final signature was placed, I didn't feel the relief I had expected. I felt empty for a moment, then calm. The figure of $333 million appeared on the documents, but it was no longer the center of the story. What mattered more was that I had taken back my ability to choose. I didn't return to Miller Software Solutions. I didn't look for a new role in the industry either. Instead, I bought back the old piece of land Eleanor had pointed out to me that rainy night. The rundown warehouses were kept at the frame level. I didn't want to erase the past. I wanted those who came later to know this place had been forgotten once and could still be used again. We named it the Miller Vance Foundation. No large sign, no grand opening. The mission was simple: provide small, flexible seed funding to people over 55 who had been pushed out of the tech industry simply for not fitting the new pace. Along with capital came mentors, not to teach them something new, but to help them believe their experience still mattered. I spent most of my time there, not in a private office, but in the shared space. I listened as they talked about being laid off, about the feeling of being replaced by someone younger. I didn't rush to give advice. I just shared what I had done wrong and what I learned when I was forced to start over. Jordan came to see me one late afternoon. No warning, no lawyers with him. He looked more tired than I remembered. We sat across from each other in an empty room with the sound of hammers and drills from the renovation outside. Jordan apologized. Briefly. No excuses. I listened, but I didn't respond with what he may have expected. I told my son I didn't need an apology to keep living. I needed him to understand that a person's value isn't in titles or control. It's in what they leave behind for others when they walk away. Jordan nodded. I don't know if he fully understood, and that was no longer my responsibility. That night I drove the old car one last time. I had restored it, not to use it, but to keep it as a reminder. I parked in front of the new incubator center and watched the lights still glowing inside. I no longer drove to survive. I drove to remember where I had been. My phone vibrated. A message from Eleanor. She said she had just turned down another deal because it didn't align with what we were building. She wrote that I had reminded her why she started investing in the first place. I looked at the screen for a long moment, then put the phone away. I stood on the balcony and looked out at the Seattle skyline. The city was still loud, still changing every day. I was no longer at its center, and for the first time in years, that didn't trouble me. I knew I was exactly where I belonged. Not because I had won, but because I had chosen an ending I could live with. If you've stayed with me until now, maybe this story touched something in you. If it made you think, consider subscribing so you don't miss the stories that come next. A like or a share could help this story reach someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my life.